Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at day number 2 of the 2024 Chess Champions Tour final, which is being held in Oslo, Norway. Now, the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen got off to a really hot start. He won all 3 matches yesterday. He's undefeated, and let's start by picking it up in the 4th match of this event with Magnus trying to stay perfect. So the players are playing 10 minutes plus 2-second increment rapid games. It's a 2-game match to determine the placement once they reach the knockout stage. Magnus starting off with white once again against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. As always, he will start with white because he is the top rated seed. Okay, so Magnus starts off with the move knight f3, we get d5, and now we have the move e3. Here we get knight to f6, and now Magnus plays move b3. Now, it's very interesting to see Magnus playing these setups with knight f3, e3, b3. Honestly, if I didn't know better, I would swear that Magnus is paying some sort of homage or a tribute to yours truly, the famous streamer Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. Now, this is something that I've played a million times online. I mean, I'm kind of saying that as a bit of a joke, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if I played this setup over 500 games, maybe even over 1,000 in online blitz games. So we got the move g6, bishop b2, bishop g7, and now Magnus plays move c4. We get c6, and here we have the move bishop to e2. Now, this is the first spot in the game where it deviates. When I played the system with white, almost always I play the move d4, and after castles, I play either bishop to d3 or the move knight b to d2. Magnus has different ideas. He plays bishop to e2, and now we get the move castles, and here we have castles and bishop to g4. Now, this is a very solid setup from Maxime Vachier-Lagrave here. He's combining the Grunfeld setup with the fianchettoed bishop, pawn on d5, but he also plays c6, so it's a combo of the Grunfeld, but also the Slav system because of the pawn structure. Now, this is a very solid setup. The famous freaking legend Grandmaster Vachier-Lagrave, he actually played this setup where you try to trade the bishop for the knight, put the pawn on e6, and hold this position with the 2 knights versus the bishop pair here. At any rate, it's something that's considered solid. Normally, you get this from different move order. One of the main ways this can occur is out of the Slav defense, where you get something like this. You go g6, knight c3, bishop g7, b3, and then bishop g4. Now, while it's considered to be very solid, one of the drawbacks here is that when you trade the bishop for the knight on f3, we get this position with knight to c3. Black is very passive. Because white has this bishop on f3, it's very hard for black to play either c5 or e5. If you go c5, I can take, and now you have problems on this long diagonal. If you ever play e5 here after takes, white probably has some tactic here to win the pawn, but even without that, after queen d2, knight c6, and rook fd1 here, there's massive pressure on the pawn. Both of the diagonals are open, and the bishops play. So when you reach this position here, you have to sort of sit and wait, which is very difficult to do, but also you're playing against the greatest positional player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, and he loves to maneuver and improve his position a lot. Now, a good example of the 2 bishops is also out of the Slav defense. There's this one specific variation, which I'll show you guys very quickly, where black can go bishop f5, knight c3, e6, and I believe the move is h3, h6, and then Magnus plays the move bishop d3, takes, bishop b4, bishop d2, takes, and this is another situation where white has a bishop and a knight. Sorry, I think I said bishop pair earlier. Where white has a bishop and a knight against the 2 knights here on b8 and d7. You'll notice it's a very similar structure. Black has this pawn triangle here, but Magnus has shown that white can be better. He's won multiple games in this against myself as well as Vachier-Lagrave here, and it's an example of how you try to improve the position very, very slowly. So now back to the game here. After e6, knight c3, we get to move a5, Magnus plays queen c2, knight a6, and now we get to move rook fd1. In the long run, Magnus wants to play e4. He wants to try and open up the diagonals for the bishop, but in the meantime, he's just going to improve the piece placement here with the rooks on d1 and the rooks on c1. Now, the rook always belongs on d1 here because you're trying to prevent black from pushing c5 or e5. So when you understand where the pawn breaks are in the position, you try to prevent them, and then you improve the pieces. And once you have achieved the perfect setup of the pieces, the harmony as we call it, then you look for the breakthrough. So we get queen e7, a3, rook b8, and now we get the move rook a c1. All pretty standard, and here MVL plays the move b5. Now, one of the drawbacks playing an opening like this Grunfeld Slav in the setup is that because white has the bishops, it's very hard to sit and wait. Now in a classical game, you could take your time, probably drink some tea, it's all good. But in a blitz or a rapid game, you feel the urge to try and come up with a plan, because if you just sit around all day long, eventually your opponent is going to prepare a break like e4 to create the big white center, and you're probably going to get positionally squeezed. So we get b5, knight to e2 from Magnus here, opening up the c file here for the queen and the rook, and now we get knight d7. Magnus trades on d5, and now he goes knight to f4. Now what you'll notice here is Magnus has some control over the c file with the queen and the rook. Additionally, the bishop can go to e2 to put pressure on the diagonal, and also you can even put the knight on d3 to launch towards c5 or e5. So there's so many ideas here with knight d3, bishop e2, control over the c file, and at this point it was already very clear that Magnus was off to a great start. So we got the move b4 here. This move is a huge positional inaccuracy from MVL. If you're playing with the black pieces here, what you want to achieve, the dream, is to go a4, b4, and then knight b6 here using the knight. You want to jump to c4 here. You shut the door on this open c file. You create a connect 5 as well as a bastion, and black is actually doing quite well. So this is a dream because of the closed c file and the knight putting a ton of pressure on the white pieces here. At any rate, this would have been much better. Now, I suspect the reason MVL didn't play this is, again, when you look at the time situation here, you don't want to spend too much time. You're trying to figure it out. You don't know. And when he goes b4, now what you'll notice after a4 is that the knight no longer has a square. When you look at the c file, the squares on c5 and c4 are covered by the pawns here. These knights are never getting to the c file here. Now white has optimal control over the c file. There's also bishop e2 and bishop b5 as well, and all the white pieces are pretty much perfectly placed with the exception of this dark square b on b2. If you could get it, you would love to put the bishop on this diagonal to target the rook on b8. So now we get knight b6. Magnus goes queen to e2, attacking the knight. You don't have knight c4 here because of the structure on the queen side, so now we get queen a7. Magnus plays knight to d3 here. He could have played rook c6, by the way, but he just wants to slow play it with knight d3 because now the knight can go to either c5 or e5. We get knight to d7, and now Magnus plays rook c6. We get rook c8, and now we have the move rook c1. Now what MVL is trying to do here is he wants to trade off all the heavy pieces. If we can get some position, I'm just going to set this up. Something like this, for example, where the queens come off the board. What you will notice here is that white is still maybe a touch better, but the bishop is very passive. These pawns cannot easily be attacked. Once you get the knight to c6, they're perfectly guarded. The bishops are very, very passive, and without e4 to open up the diagonals, which you can't play because the pawn hangs, it's simply completely fine for black. So the dream here for black is that you want to get into this position where you can trade off all the heavy material. If the heavy material comes off the board, then white will not be better at all. However, Magnus plays queen c2. Now you have a double stack. Rook c8 is not possible, so we get the move rook to d8. Now it would have been interesting to see what would have happened after knight b6 here. This is a move that MVL could have tried to play. If this occurs, white is actually much better after the move e4, but without this e4 move, it is not so clear. But the reason white's much better after e4 is if you take, now suddenly you have a wooden shield, all the diagonals are opening up. Combine that with a double stack on the c file, and white is already close to winning. So we get the move rook to d8. Here MVL is desperately trying to stop Magnus from playing e4 to open up the diagonals here. He also is trying to stop Magnus from infiltrating on the c file, but the combination of the threat with e4 combined with the control over the c file means that white has a significant advantage. So we get the move queen c1. Now Maxime plays knight to b8. We get rook c2, and now we have knight d7 back. Here Magnus plays move bishop e2, another nice quiet move here. There's no actual threat immediately, but when you put the bishop here, black always has to worry about this knight being attacked on the diagonal. This is also why in chess bishops tend to be a little bit more heavily valued than knights, because just to illustrate the point, if we reach something like this with h6 knight f4, the knight is always being spied upon. The knight can never attack this bishop, but the bishop can always spy the knight from distance. So we get the move bishop to f8. Now we have knight to e5 being played, and here MVL goes knight d to b8. Already here, it's a very, very bad spot to be in. If you trade the knights on e5 here, you could try to go knight c5, but white would sack the rook for the bishop and the knight. And here the two Bs should be better than the rook. And if you don't go for knight c5, let's just say you play bishop e7. Now I can go bishop d4, covering the square. And in the long run, let's just say you play, I don't know, king f8. There's now bishop b5 followed by rook c6. And black is going to get crushed on the c file. Just a sample line, h6, rook c6. Knight b8, rook c7, queen guards the rook. You go back, and after rook to a7, look at the bishops and the rook here. White is completely winning the game. So we get knight d to b8, and now Magnus plays h4. Now this shows great understanding because Magnus has achieved the absolute maximum here. You'll notice that Maxime is desperately trying to cover the c6 and c7 squares with the knight, but now Magnus starts launching on the other side of the board, and this fits one of the maxims in chess, which is that in general we have a rule that if there is one weakness in a position, you generally can defend it, but if there are two weaknesses, normally it is too much because you're having to try to defend here and there. It's very hard to do that. And when you look at D's knights, they're simply sitting on the queen side and out of play. So we get the move bishop d6. Magnus plays h5, and now we get knight c7. MVL trying to bring this knight back to the king side, but it's simply too little too late. Magnus goes e4 here, a great positional sacrifice, and now we get the move bishop takes knight. If MVL were to play pawn takes pawn here, there are many ways for white to win, but probably the cleanest is simply go takes, and queen g5 here, attacking the rook on d8. Play something like rook to e8, and now you can sack the knight, and after takes, king f8. Many ways for white to win, but probably the cleanest is to go check, and then d5, opening up the AA battery on the diagonal here, and the black king is getting checkmated. So we get the move bishop takes knight. Magnus takes back. Now there's the threat of capturing the knight, so we get the move knight to e8. Magnus plays queen g5, and here we get the move rook c8. Now you're probably thinking, well, MVL has been able to trade off the rooks. Now there are only queens and bishops on the board, which would be fine, except for the fact that after takes, you'll notice that all of the diagonals are open for the bishops when you combine that with the threats around the weakened black king on g8 due to the lack of a fianchettoed bishop. This is simply going to be a devastating attack. So we get bishop b5. Knight c6 is played, and now Magnus plays the move h6. Now he could have played a move like queen to c1, which I believe would have simply won the game on the spot, because you're attacking the knight here. If the knight goes away, you trade the queens and win the knight here. GG, why not? But Magnus plays h6 instead. Now perhaps Magnus was thinking about the memes here, and maybe he was thinking, I can go queen f6 and get the classic lolly checkmate with queen to g7, and the king is mated. So we get h6. Here Maxime plays queen e6, and now Magnus plays the move queen c1, attacking the knight. We get knight to a7, and now we have the move queen c5. Here we get knight to c8, and now Magnus plays the move g3. At this point, this is a quiet move, not the only way to win, but because of how passive the knights are, the weaknesses of with the king on g8 here, it's just too much to defend everything. So we get g5. Now we have queen to e3, f6, and Magnus plays the move queen d4. Now what you will notice at this point is the players have gotten very low on time. It was evident to me that Magnus was spending too much time here. He has a great position here, but he was trying to be too perfect, trying to be too precise, not allow any counterplay. And this leads to a situation where with limited time on the clock, specifically a handful of seconds, mistakes can occur. So we get queen d4, and now knight c7 is played. This is the fatal error after which the game ends. It's still probably losing anyway, but if Maxime had played king f7, we get queen d3 and f5. At least temporarily, the diagonal is closed. You're holding the pawns in the center of the board, and if you get a couple more moves, like say knight to e7 and maybe like knight c7, suddenly black could be back in the game because the bishops simply have no targets on the diagonals. At any rate, we get the move knight to c7, and now Magnus plays pawn takes pawn. We get knight takes bishop, and now the bone crusher pawn to f7. You have to take with the king. If you take with the queen, there's queen h8 checkmate with the AA battery. So you take, now there's check, winning the pawn. Now you have a passed h pawn to rush up the board. We get knight e7, pawn takes knight, and here MVL plays queen e2. At this point, the game is effectively over. White has the two passed pawns. The king is pinned, or the knight is pinned here. There's no way back, but MVL tries to hope for a miracle. So we get queen e2. Now Magnus plays bishop f6, an all-star move here because with the passed h pawn, the game is effectively over as you can trade off the pieces on e7. So we get a4, takes, and here MVL resigns. If you were to trade the queens here and take the bishop, h7 wins the game. Unfortunately for black, you're losing by one tempo. And if you were to play the move a takes b3, now there's bishop f6 covering the diagonal here, and you're free to push p with the h or the b pawns. And last but not least, if a3, once again, simply bishop f6 followed by bishop to a1, and with both these pawns going up the board, you will win. So an absolute masterpiece of a game from Magnus here, a phenomenal positional win, showing just how good the bishops can be when you get the bishop here. Just keep improving the position slowly but surely, try to place the piece well, open up the diagonals, and then crush. Now obviously easier said than done, but this shows why it's so difficult to play against Magnus, because when you get these slightly worse positions, he's like a boa constrictor, just keeps improving slowly. He suffocates you, in this case suffocating these knights and winning a great game. So Magnus would win the first game of the match. However, in the second game, much like in this first game, his time usage would not be great. He would get outplayed, he would blunder when he was low on time, and this match would go to Armageddon. Now, in the Armageddon game, Magnus would actually be completely lost. He was getting outplayed once again, but MVL would let it slip pretty much at the last moment. Magnus would save the draw with the black pieces to win the match against Maxime. So Magnus gets a nice win in the fourth round against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. In the fifth round, he would play against Alireza Firouzja. Now they would play two very uneventful draws, and they would have a rather exciting Armageddon game, but that would also end in a draw where Alireza would underbid Magnus by 3 seconds to play with the black pieces. With 3 draws in the match, that would mean that Alireza would hand Magnus his first loss in this round robin format, and that means Magnus moves to 4-1 overall. So the next game we're going to be looking at is from the 6th match against Levon Aronian, formerly world number 2 ranked player in the world. He's a little bit older now, not as strong as he once was, but still someone who is quite formidable. So Magnus again playing with the white pieces in the best of 2 match, since he is the number 1 seed, and the game starts out with the move e4. Levon plays a Sicilian. We get knight f3 d6, d4 takes, knight f6, knight c3, and now the move a6. Now, Levon is struggling mightily in this event. I would also say, seeing as Levon is past his prime, he's trying to experiment a lot more these days. He's trying to play freer chess instead of simply playing e5 on move 1 every game, and it is great to see how he is experimenting. Now, against Magnus, who's played the knight order with both white and black, there are some issues here because there are a lot of positional variations, and Magnus chooses one of those lines. We got bishop e2, e5, knight b3, and now we have the move bishop e7, and here Magnus plays this move bishop g5. Now this is an example of a variation which is very tough to play from the black side. I might have even had this against Magnus myself, I'm not sure, because after bishop e6 you get takes, and now you have the move queen d3. Now we get castles, and here we get the move bishop e7, and Magnus plays knight d5. Now, one of the ways that you can play this is you can play knight c6, castles, knight d4, but after takes, knight d5, takes, and castles here, white can play moves like h4, and even though the computer says this is equal with perfect play, it's very difficult to play from the black side, primarily because you're lacking in counterplay. White is trying to push the p on the king side. Just a sample line is something like queen to a5, then white goes king b1, let's say rook e8 here, and now white goes g4 followed by g5, and even though material is even, white is very quickly attacking on the king side, while black does not have an open diagonal, the pawn's in the way, and you don't really have any open files either. Computer says it's fine overall, but very hard to play, and against a great positional player like Magnus in general, I think it's asking for a lot of trouble. So that's why Levon decides to castle instead, and now we get bishop e7 to guard the pawn on d6 here, and Magnus plays knight d5. We get takes, queen b6, and now we have the move rook hf1 guarding the pawn. Levon plays knight d7, we get knight to d2 here, and now we have the move bishop g5. Now this move is a surprisingly bad decision from Levon. Objectively, it looks very normal, just trade the bishop for the knight, because when you look at this position, you figure, well, if you get this position, the knight can jump to c4 or e3, why not exchange the bishop? Now, if you could get this position, just to illustrate it, something like this, for example, black would be completely fine here because now you have a knight pressuring the pawn on e4. You're intending to open up the center with d5, and the bishop on e2 is actually not a very good piece. Unfortunately, when Levon plays this move, as you're about to see, you simply aren't going to get everything you want in this situation. So we got knight to f6. Actually, sorry, my mistake. You do get the same position. What am I saying? Sorry. Slight slip on my part, but we are recording this live, so I do apologize for that. And now we get to move queen b3. Now, queen d3 is actually fine here, but after queen b3, what you will notice is that in this position, if you trade the queens on b3 here, after takes and knight takes b3, black is okay in this position with the move knight takes e4, but again, after bishop to f3, there's pressure on these pawns on the diagonal, and it's very hard to play. So after queen b3, we got queen c7, and now we have the move knight to c4, and here white is keeping both the bishop and the knight on the board in this position. And now, even though black is probably okay, you have the bishop on g5, which is staring at an empty diagonal, and the pawn on d6 is a serious weakness, whereas the bishop, if it were on e7, would simply guard the pawn. So we get b5 here. Now this is an inspired move from Levon. I think probably he saw rook a d8 and he thought after bishop to f3, b5, and knight to e3, white is a little bit better here because white will stack the towers and put pressure on the pawn. And with the bishop on f3, d5 is not an option, and white also has g4, g5 as well. So we get b5. Magnus takes a juicer, and now we get rook a d8, and here we have the move queen a3 being played. Now computer wants some weird h4 move, but Magnus plays queen a3, and what I think happens here is Levon is saying, you know what, white's up a pawn temporarily because he's won the pawn on d6, but the pawn on e4 is weak, the knight is under attack potentially, there's got to be some tactic. Unfortunately, there is not a tactic, and you're simply down a pawn. So you get queen c6, Magnus goes f3 here, creating the classic connect 3 pawn chain, and now we get the move g6. Magnus goes c4, important move because here when you go g6 you're trying to stop the escape for the knight here to f5, and if white plays, let's just say h3 for example, after knight h5 here there's a very nasty idea of bishop to e7 pinning the knight and winning the game. So we get c4 here, trying to chip away at the black pawn structure. If you need it, you can even go c5 to reinforce the horse on d6. We get b4 takes, and now we get to move bishop e3. Computer thinks that after knight d7 is still better for white, but it's a little bit better than the game. We get bishop e3, Magnus plays knight b7, and now we get to move rook b8. Here we have the move knight to a5, another great move being played. You could try to play a move like rook to b6 here, or rook d6, but after queen c7 takes queen a3, now black gets bishop c5, let's just say queen a4, and after queen d8 suddenly there are all these threats on the dark squares toward the white king on b1. So we get knight a5. Magnus has jumped around with the horsey. We get queen c7, queen a4, and now white is up 2 pawns on the queen side. However, black does have this open file, so it does still require some precision, but Magnus is well on his way to winning the game, it would seem. So we get rook b6. Magnus goes knight b3 here. Great move. Knight covers any threats towards the pawn on b2, and it also potentially supports the pawn thrust with c5. We get bishop c5, takes, and now Magnus plays rook d2. We get rook b8, and here we have a shocker with this move, rook f to d1. This move actually throws away the win here, but Levon is a little bit low on time, and he plays king g7. Probably Levon might have seen rook b4, and after takes rook b6, white cannot go queen a7 because of the classic fossil. You sack the rook, checking the king, and after takes, now you have a queen for a rook, and you win the game. And when white goes queen a4, rook b4, after queen c2, you can sack the rook for the queen. We get this position with takes, and after king g7, even though white has 2 pawns here, 2 rooks and 2 pawns for the queen, due to the passive bishop on e2, the ability to start maneuvering this knight around to d4, just to show you guys what I mean by that. Say you get this knight coming to d4 here, suddenly black is completely fine. You have a bastion with the knight protected, it hits the pawn, and white's bishop is simply absolutely horrible on f1. So computer says that in this position, the best white can do here is maybe play queen to a6 and take the draw. You could go queen c2 and save the game, but honestly, I feel like in a rapid or blitz game, at this point with the knight coming around to the center of the board, I would be desperately trying to make a draw here with the white pieces. Instead, we get king g7, and now Magnus plays rook c2. We get a5, and here we have the move a3, stopping rook b4, but more importantly, preparing to escape with the king to a2. We get h5, h4, rook b3, and now the move king a2. Levon plays queen b6 here, and now we get the move rook d2. Black does have a legendary triple stack on the file, but the double stack laterally guards the pawn against the checkmate threats. Here Levon plays knight d7, and this is a move that I really applaud because it's a tricky move here to try and steer the game in a direction where there are complications, and if Magnus is not tactically sharp, he could still lose the game. So here we get queen takes knight. You can't take with the rook because then black does crash through and checkmates the white king. So we get takes, and now Levon sacks the rook with rook takes pawn. If you take with a king, it's checkmate. Take with a pawn, it's checkmate. So here you go king b1. Now we get queen to b3, trying to checkmate the white king, and Magnus plays rook d3. We get check, king c1, check, king d2, and now we have the move rook a2. Now you will notice here that Magnus is up a bishop here. It's a very passive bishop, mind you, but if he can trade off the rooks or stem this attack, he will win the game quite easily. Now, one thing that should be said about Magnus is that it felt like today he was a little bit off. Some of the games he played against MVL weren't great. The games against Alireza weren't amazing. And because it feels like Magnus is a little bit off, I was not sure that he would find the best defensive resource. So here we got the move b3, and this is actually a serious mistake. What Magnus should have played here is either rook to a3. This is probably the least likely idea. Trading the rooks off the board, and now the king is very safe with the rook and the bishop around it, or playing the move I believe the move rook d to c3, and after black takes with the rook here, you can simply play a move like queen to d5. The rooks guard each other. Black doesn't have a way to break through, and white will be winning with the extra bishop. The sample line is something like queen b1, where you can go bishop d1, and now there simply are no threats for black. Instead, we got b3. Levon plays the move a4, and now everything is starting to spiral a little bit out of control here for Magnus, because at this point, even though he has the extra bishop, now this pawn is coming down the board. There are threats towards the king on the second rank, and it's actually not clearly winning. So we get takes, and now we have king e3, we got pawn takes, and the move queen to c7. Now here, even though black is down a bishop, Levon has the passed b pawn to try and push up the board. There's still some chance to maybe get a swindle. So we get b2, Magnus takes, we get king h7. You do not go to the back rank here because either g8 or f8 allows white to capture the rook with check, and you're unable to push your p and get a second queen. And if you go king to h6 here, white can also take the rook, because after you queen, there's simply queen to h8, checkmating the king. The king has no escape square. So we get the move king to h7. Magnus plays rook to d7 here, creating the kebab and threatening to checkmate this king on the 7th rank. Levon plays rook to f8, and now we get the move bishop d3. Here Levon promotes the pawn, we get takes, and now we have the move king f2, check, king g3, and queen takes c4. Now what's amazing is all the dust has settled here. We're in an endgame where Magnus has an extra pawn on the board, but the good thing is the tactics are gone, and Magnus excels at these endgames. So now we get the move queen to d5. Levon trades the queens. Magnus takes with the pawn. If he were to take with the rook, this is a theoretical draw with the 4 pawns versus 3 on the same side of the board. So Magnus takes with the pawn to create the passed pawn on the d file. So we get king g7. Magnus goes king f4, we get rook to e8, and now we have the move rook a7. Levon plays rook to e2, and now Magnus goes g4. Here we get takes, and the move king to f8. Now you will notice here that Magnus is completely winning, but one of the great things here is that for Levon, with only 7 seconds on the clock, it is a rook and pawn endgame. There are not many options. You go rook f2, rook h2, or rook d2. Without so many options, the chance to go wrong are a little bit less. Now here Magnus plays d6, and this move is still winning for white, but it makes the task a little bit more complicated here. Probably rook to a4 was the cleanest way to win here, primarily because the rook guards these pawns. So if black were to go here, you can play rook e4. The pawn endgame is winning here. You create the classic wide peepos. And if black plays a move like rook to g2, now you go king e5. The rook guards the pawns on g4 and h4. You can run this king and push the pawn. This is a technically winning endgame. This would have been the cleanest way to win, but Magnus goes d6 instead. Now we get king e8, and here we have this horrible move king to g5. Now as you'll notice from the eval bar, this move changes the evaluation from completely winning for white to a draw. That being said, 7 seconds on the clock, only one move to draw the game here, and Levon misses it when he plays the move rook e4. If Levon had played the move rook to g2, this game is now a draw according to the computer, because here if you play rook e7, I go back, and then king e8. And if you try to play a move like h5, I simply take, and after rook d2, this pawn on d6 is weak. You can't win anymore. And you also, if you try to go king f6 here, this is a draw because after takes, if you check, the king runs up. If you check, the king runs over. There's simply no way to win. So you're unable to move the king forward. You can't create the outside passed pawn because of the pin, and here the game is simply over. But Levon, with only 7 seconds on the clock, plays the move rook e4 instead, and now Magnus does not miss. He checks, he plays rook to f8 here, trying to win this pawn on f7. If the base of the pawn chain falls on f7, you'll lose g6, just a sample line, something like this. And with 2 connected pawns, this is a very simple win. So Levon plays the move f5. Now Magnus trades on f5, and here he plays the move h5, pushing the p here as fast as he can. You might notice this could look a bit similar to an endgame that was played recently between Magnus and Fabiano with an edge pawn, where there was a classic Vancouver setup. But in this case, there's no Vancouver because the rook is not in front of the pawn. So Magnus goes h5. Levon takes. We get h6 here. Magnus now 2 squares away from getting a queen and ending the game. Levon plays rook g4. Magnus plays king h5. He could have taken here on f5 as well, but one of the reasons you don't want to take this pawn is because after rook to h4, since it is a pawn on the edge of the board, you're always a little bit leery about there being some drawing trick. So we get king h5. Now Magnus is just going to push the pawn to h7, get this queen, and end the game. Levon plays rook g2. We get h7, check, king g6, and now we have the move f4. And here Magnus promotes the pawn to a queen, and at this point Levon Aronian resigns the game because after rook takes queen, takes, and king e5, unfortunately you're one move too slow. If it were black's move and you could get, say, f3, I guess it's still winning, but just to illustrate the point, if you could get here, move the king forward and push the pawn, it's a draw. But as you'll notice in this position, after takes, king e5, white can simply go king g5. If you go f3, there's rook f8, king e4, king g4. Now you win the pawn with a king and a rook versus a lone king. You will win this 100% of the time. So a little bit unfortunate for Levon that he has to resign here after fighting his way back in the game to a position where it was a draw. But this really also highlights the strength of Magnus Carlsen, which is that even though he made some mistakes in this game, there were the times when Levon had the chance to draw, there was only one move to save the game, and he was low on time, and it was just asking a little bit too much. Now in the second game, Magnus would take a trip on the wild side. He would take a ride on the wild side. He would play a very interesting variation within the Sicilian. He was actually losing for most of the game. Levon would miss his opportunity, getting too low on time once again. Magnus would save the draw and win the match, meaning that after day 2, Magnus is still in the clear lead of the Chess Champions Grand Tour Final in the year 2024 with a score of 5 points out of 6 from the matches. Even though some of his matches have gone to Armageddon, he clearly is showing his form and class and why he is considered to be the best player in the world. So nothing super surprising for Magnus overall. Perhaps losing the Armageddon to Alireza could be shocking, but even when Magnus, it would seem, is not playing his best, he still is the best player in the world. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from day number 2 of the 2024 Chess Champions Chess Tour, I should say, Grand Final being held in Oslo, Norway. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap tomorrow and the coming days as we see if Magnus can go wire to wire and win this event once again. All right, you guys, I'll see you very soon. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Bye.